Hello and welcome to another TorchCast. I'm Dwayne Lester, editor of the Missouri Torch. Today we're going to talk with Senator Eric Schmitt about some legislation he's proposing that would limit the amount of money cities could put into their budget from their municipal courts. Right now it's at about 30%. He wants to limit it to 10. Senator Schmitt, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me, what's the genesis of this legislation? How did you come around to putting this together?
Well, I think for far too long we have too many municipalities too dependent on traffic tickets and fines and these schemes, these speed traps to fund bloated government. And I think it's time that conservatives start calling it out for what it is and make changes. I think that right now we've got a law on the books called the Max Creek Law, named after a small rural town that was a notorious speed trap that was funding an inordinate amount of its budget through this speed trap, this traffic ticket scheme. And what the statute currently limits municipalities to, they can't have more than 30% of their budget based off those traffic tickets and fines. And I think that number is just too high. So my proposal would lower it to 10%, and I think add some real accountability to the way that municipalities are funding themselves. I think you've got a situation where I'm at in St. Louis County. You've got 14 municipalities in St. Louis County alone that traffic tickets and fines are their single biggest source of revenue. You've got 81 municipal courts in St. Louis County. That's 61 more than the next biggest circuit anywhere in the state. About 50% of the traffic tickets and fines are derived from the St. Louis Metro, and it's about 22% of the population. But this isn't a problem that's just in the St. Louis area. You've got towns all across the state, quite frankly, that are funding bloated government through these traffic ticket schemes. For example, on the western side of the state, Mosley has 35%, Fleming has 38%, and Randolph, the city of Randolph, funds 75% of its budget from traffic tickets and fines. So they're all across the state. And again, I just think it's something we have to right this wrong, because as somebody that believes very firmly in the protections of the Constitution, a lot of people, their interaction with government is through the court system. And you've got in St. Louis County, again, about 40% of the courts don't allow kids in the courtroom. You've got a lot of abuses going on. And when people are just viewed as revenue generating ATMs, which is, I think, what's happening right now in a lot of places, that's wrong. And I think it's time for us to fix it.
One thing that I saw right out of the gate when you started proposing this, when you entered it, was that it received a lot of bipartisan support. Have you seen that?
Yeah, it's really an interesting issue. Really across the political spectrum. Conservatives see the abuses of government that doesn't want to live within its means and simply supplant revenue that was lost somewhere else by finding innovative ways to fine people. And then there are liberals that support it because they see the injustice that's being carried out also in the court system as we do. So that's usually a recipe for us to get something done. I'll give you a great example, Dwayne, of something I grew up in North St. Louis County here, and there was a municipality, St. Anne, that once had the largest mall in the country, Northwest Plaza. They never had cops out on Highway 70 pulling people over for traffic tickets. Now that mall is gone. It's been demolished, and all of a sudden now we have a speed trap there. And it's indicative of a problem that exists really all over this state, is that cities are failing to live within their means, and they're finding these backdoor ways of extracting more and more from the people. And government doesn't exist to find those ways to extract more and more. I think we ought to expect better than that. And they're just abuses really all across the state that have been brought to light more recently. And I think, again, it's time to fix it.
Now, to play devil's advocate here, I don't know if you saw the post I did on your legislation, but there's a video of this crosswalk in Boston, yeah. And the guy's he's a cop, and he's just walking across the street and back, and there's another officer in a patrol car nearby, and he's just waiting for someone to not follow this regulation that says if someone's in the crosswalk they have to stop. Then they pull him over and they give him a ticket, and over, I think it was a 2-week period, they generated $40,000 just from this one effort on the crosswalk law. So the devil's advocate says if you're following the law, if you're not speeding, you're not going to be ticketed, and all they're doing is enforcing the law. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think, look, as an attorney too, I care very deeply about the rule of law. But I think what's happened is this has evolved. If you just look at the evidence and look at the facts of the places where this is happening, where the real abuses are happening, it's being used to fund government, and that's really not what this is supposed to be. I think it's appropriate for people to be pulled over, to be cited for violations. However, when you essentially have created a system of taxation by citation, which is really what this has come to, it's an abuse, and I think we have to have the courage to call it out. And plus, the other thing is, police officers that I've talked to, who also are very supportive of this, they didn't go to the police academy to write tickets all day. They went in for this idea of community policing, making their communities better and safer. That time they could better spend building relationships with people in the community. And again, not to meet the budget expectations of city managers, which is essentially what this has come. And all you need to know about this issue, Dwayne, is that there are actually cities in our state that budget more for traffic tickets and fines for the next year in their budget. And so that's when this becomes less about enforcing the law and really about abuse. And I know you've talked about this issue before, and a lot of conservative groups have talked about this in the past. And I think this is a great way for us to rein these abuses in, and it's really about the size and scope of government. And I think it's, like I said, it's a unique coalition of folks that support this, which I think will allow us to get something done.
There's a couple of things you said there that I want to make sure get highlighted. We're talking about cities actually turning their police force into tax collectors by what you said, taxation through citation. That's a great phrase. I don't know if you came up with that or not, but that's top notch. I like that, because that really changes the paradigm on what we're talking about. We're talking about taking someone who is there to protect and serve, and you're turning them into a tax collector, and that's powerful stuff. And another thing I want to...
The other thing too, Dwayne, let me mention this too, because here's how this plays out, and this is a problem that we ought to care for. People that believe in the Constitution, we've created modern day debtor prisons. We're not supposed to have that in this country. These are civil offenses, and you've got a situation where somebody gets a speeding ticket 7 miles over or 11 miles over, and life happens. They miss a court date. Okay, well, at that point, there's a failure to appear that usually goes out. There's a bench warrant issued. People get thrown in prison, and they have to make a decision sometimes between paying a babysitter or paying a fine, or they're in jail. They miss their job. They can't pay their rent. I mean, these are things that are happening. And as people that believe in what this country's all about, we ought to be able to right those wrongs, because, as you mentioned, police officers in many cases are being used by these city managers to meet budget expectations or to grow government, and that's a problem. That's a real problem for us.
Yeah, and another thing that you pointed out was the opportunity cost. While these guys are sitting in a speed trap, there are other things they could be doing. They could be meeting with the community, building those bridges that clearly need to be built or rebuilt. That they could be preventing a serious crime from happening. They could be making contact so that in the future they could prevent a serious crime. So all the things that could happen never do, because they're sitting in a speed trap in order for the city government to meet budget rather than cutting things that they should be cutting.
That's exactly right. And it's also, when you talk about relationship building, it's not the ideal scenario for citizens to come in contact with their city on one hand. And on the other hand, on a more fundamental level, it's also leads to a breakdown in trust between people and their government and their court system. And the courts are supposed to be protecting people's constitutional rights, not be part of this system that is really abusive at this point.
Now, who's it impacting the most?
Well, I think it's pushing the poorest further into poverty, and that's something we all ought to be concerned about. This is not this isn't something that I don't think that was originally intended. I think they're well-meaning people. We've set up these court systems to enforce laws, and that's fine, and we ought to enforce laws. But when this has become a situation where a municipality, Calverton Park here, over two-thirds of their budget is funded by traffic tickets and fines. When the city I mentioned in western Missouri, Randolph, when 3/4 of its budget is based on traffic tickets and fines, I think we have to start asking some fundamental questions about, again, the size and scope of government, and really making government live within its means, as opposed to replacing revenue that has been lost somewhere, or finding new things to spend money on, and we're going to use a traffic ticket scheme or a speed trap to fund it. And that's what's happening. And I think that's the abuse that people viscerally understand is happening, and why there's a lot of momentum for us to get something done here. And it's correcting something that's very fundamental. The people's interaction with the court system is something that people should care very much about. And I think this is again the abuse that we're talking about and why it's ripe for reform.
So tell me how this is going to work through the Senate and the House. How do you see it working?
So I've pre-filed a bill that would change Max Creek law from the 30% cap to the 10% cap. Representative Paul Kurtman is going to handle this in the House. Paul, as you know, is a champion for liberty issues, and I think that, as he and I have talked about, this is something that we ought to really spend a lot of time and energy on. So it's been pre-filed. It's Senate Bill 5. My hope is that it will be sent to my committee, which would be a good way for us to get this thing moving early. I'm telling you, Dwayne, what's really fascinating about this issue is since I've filed it, there have been regular folks, citizens that have reached out to me and told me their stories about some of the abuses that have taken place, how they've been mistreated in the system, how these speed traps exist solely for the growth of government and to really buttress a bloated government in their own municipality. And so we're going to have testimony. We're going to have people there to tell their story, because this really is something that's bubbled up from the ground up. And I think we'll get it moving early. Right now, the consequences for violating it, right now it's a self-reporting system. I think we want to take a look at that, because you have a number of municipalities all across the state that are violating the current Max Creek law, but they're not being held to account. Auditor Schweik is currently doing an audit. The Attorney General has actually filed a lawsuit finally to bring these folks into compliance. The other consequences are they're supposed to lose jurisdiction of the traffic ticket citations in those municipal courts, and they're also supposed to turn that excess over to the state to put into the education fund. None of those things are happening. So we need to have stronger enforcement provisions, and maybe look at some other things that might get these municipalities and these city managers' attention, who are clearly thumbing their nose at the law.
So if someone wants to get in touch with you with one of their stories, how can they do that?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Eric_Schmitt, SCHMITT. But my official, my Senate phone number is 573-751-2853, or eSchmitt, SCHMITT, at senate.mo.gov. And we'd love to hear from people. This is a cause worth fighting for. There's a lot of injustice that's happening, and I think this is a great cause for conservatives to get behind in 2015.
Outstanding. Well, thank you for your time, Senator. I appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone who took the time to watch this episode of the TorchCast. Please subscribe to our channel and tell a friend about this. I appreciate your time and your effort in making this legislation become reality. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more of them in the future, please consider making a donation to the Missouri Torch here. And please subscribe to our new YouTube channel and visit us at themissouritorch.com.